There comes a moment in every empath's life when exhaustion stops looking like sadness and starts looking like silence. Not the wounded silence of someone begging to be understood, but the terrifying silence of someone who no longer needs permission to walk away. For years, you explained yourself carefully. You clarified your intentions. You replayed conversations in your head at 2 a.m., wondering if maybe you were too emotional, too intense, too sensitive, too honest. You carried the emotional weight of entire rooms while people accused you of being dramatic for finally breaking under the pressure. And the strangest part? Most people never realized how much effort it took for you to stay kind. Because empaths are rarely loud about their suffering. They bleed internally. They absorb tension silently. They overanalyze conflict because harmony matters deeply to them. They try to fix misunderstandings before they become fractures. They explain because they believe understanding can save connection. But eventually, something changes. Not suddenly, not violently, quietly. The empath notices that explanations no longer create clarity. They create access. Every vulnerable confession becomes ammunition. Every attempt to communicate becomes another opportunity for manipulation, dismissal, or emotional exhaustion. And slowly, the empath begins to understand a painful truth. Some people were never confused. They simply benefited from your constant emotional labor. That realization changes everything. Because once an empath stops explaining, the entire power dynamic shifts. The people who depended on your reactions suddenly feel disconnected from you. The manipulators who relied on your guilt begin losing control. The emotionally immature become uncomfortable because they can no longer provoke the emotional performances they once fed on. Your silence becomes heavier than your words ever were. And this is the part nobody talks about. An empath's silence is not weakness. It is emotional intelligence evolving into emotional discipline. It is the moment compassion stops sacrificing itself for people committed to misunderstanding it. You stop defending your boundaries. You stop chasing closure. You stop over-explaining your absence to people who ignored your pain when you were present. And ironically, this is often when people finally start listening. Because human psychology works in disturbing ways. People often ignore what is always available. They underestimate those who constantly explain themselves. But when access disappears, perception changes instantly. The empath who once begged to be heard becomes unreadable, calm, still, untouchable. And that silence terrifies people more than anger ever could. Because anger still reveals attachment. Silence reveals detachment. And once an empath emotionally detaches, something ancient awakens inside them. A form of silent power that no longer seeks validation, revenge, or approval. Only peace. But reaching that stage comes with a brutal transformation most people never see. A transformation born from betrayal, emotional overload, and the painful realization that not everyone deserves access to your inner world. Today, we explore the psychological shift that happens the day an empath stops explaining, and why that silence becomes the strongest thing they have ever possessed. At first, the empath does not stop explaining because they become cold. They stop explaining because they become tired. There is a psychological exhaustion that forms when someone spends years translating their heart into languages other people pretend not to understand. Every conversation starts to feel like emotional courtroom defense. Every boundary requires a 20-minute justification. Every hurt feeling becomes something they must prove instead of something they are allowed to feel. And empaths, more than most people, are vulnerable to this trap. because they naturally assume others value emotional honesty the same way they do. So they explain patiently, again and again and again. They explain why certain words hurt them. They explain why disrespect affects trust. They explain why emotional inconsistency creates anxiety. They explain why silence after conflict feels manipulative. They explain because they believe clarity creates connection. But emotionally intelligent people usually understand after the first conversation. The ones who keep forcing you to explain are often studying your tolerance, not your feelings. That realization becomes the empath's first awakening. The problem was never communication. The problem was access. Some people learn your emotional patterns the way predators learn routines. They observe what triggers guilt in you. They notice how quickly you forgive. They discover that if they confuse you long enough, you eventually abandon your own boundaries just to restore peace. And the empath often participates in this cycle unknowingly. Not because they are weak, because they are deeply conditioned to preserve connection. Psychologists sometimes describe this as trauma-adapted harmony seeking, the tendency to over-maintain emotional stability because conflict once felt unsafe. Many empaths grew up learning that love had to be earned through emotional management, so they became experts at reading moods, softening tension, and explaining themselves before rejection could happen. But there comes a breaking point, a moment where the empath notices something terrifying. No amount of explaining changes people who are committed to misunderstanding you. That sentence alone can alter an entire identity. Because once the empath understands this, they begin reclaiming something they abandoned long ago, their emotional energy. And suddenly, silence appears. Not dramatic silence, not performative silence, sacred silence. The kind that no longer feels the need to defend every decision. The kind that stops interrupting its own peace just to keep others comfortable. The kind that realizes being misunderstood is sometimes safer than being emotionally consumed. This is where silent power begins. Not in dominance, not in revenge, but in restraint. When an empath begins withdrawing their explanations, people around them often become strangely unsettled. Not because the empath became cruel, but because the emotional access people once had is suddenly gone. This is the psychological paradox most empaths never notice. Many relationships were unconsciously built around your emotional availability, not mutual understanding. People became accustomed to your constant openness. Your reactions reassured them. Your long messages, emotional processing, and repeated attempts to fix things gave them a sense of control over the connection. Even your pain kept the relationship alive, because as long as you were explaining, you were still emotionally invested. But silence changes the atmosphere completely. Silence forces people to confront themselves without your emotional energy cushioning the impact. And for emotionally immature individuals, this feels deeply uncomfortable. They are used to provoking reactions, not reflection. They know how to navigate your emotions, but they do not know how to handle your emotional absence. So they panic. Some suddenly become kinder, others become aggressive. Some accuse you of changing, others attempt to provoke you back into the old cycle, because your calmness now threatens the dynamic they once controlled. And this is where the empath faces one of the hardest psychological battles of all. The urge to explain one last time. One final paragraph. One final clarification. One final attempt to make people see the truth. But mature emotional intelligence understands something painful. Closure is not always found through communication. Sometimes closure is accepting that certain people understood your pain perfectly, and simply chose themselves anyway. That realization burns deeply inside empaths because they naturally search for hidden goodness in people. They assume confusion before cruelty, misunderstanding before manipulation. But once patterns repeat enough times, intuition begins speaking louder than hope. And intuition is the empath's hidden superpower. Not fantasy, not mind reading, pattern recognition. Empaths notice emotional inconsistencies faster than most people. They sense shifts in tone, energy, intention, and emotional presence long before others do. The problem is not that they fail to see red flags. The problem is that they often explain those red flags away, until one day they stop. And when they stop, something remarkable happens psychologically. Their nervous system begins calming for the first time in years. No more rehearsing conversations endlessly. No more emotional overfunctioning. No more carrying relationships entirely on their back. Just stillness. And in that stillness, the empath discovers something shocking. Peace feels unfamiliar when chaos has been your normal. That is why silence initially feels lonely. But eventually, it starts feeling powerful. The most dangerous stage in an empath's transformation is not when they become angry. It is when they become emotionally clear. Because anger still carries emotional attachment. Anger still hopes to be acknowledged. It still wants justice, recognition, or change. But clarity is different. Clarity removes illusion. It cuts through emotional confusion like light entering a dark room for the first time. And once an empath sees clearly, they can never fully return to who they were before. They begin recognizing patterns they once ignored. They notice how certain people only reached out when they needed emotional support. They notice how apologies arrived only after consequences appeared. They notice how some individuals loved their empathy, but resented their boundaries. This realization creates an internal conflict that feels almost spiritual. Because empaths do not enjoy becoming distant. It hurts them. They genuinely wanted mutual love, emotional safety, and honest connection. They wanted relationships where understanding flowed naturally, instead of being dragged through emotional warfare every week. So when they finally detach, it is rarely impulsive. It is accumulated disappointment. Years of swallowing discomfort. Years of minimizing intuition. Years of explaining pain to people who responded with defensiveness instead of care. And eventually, the empath reaches emotional saturation, a psychological threshold where the nervous system quietly decides, no more. This is the birth of silent power. Not loud dominance, not cold revenge, but the ability to emotionally detach without needing others to validate the decision. That level of self-control changes everything, because emotionally reactive people are easy to manipulate. If someone can control your emotions, they can control your focus, your peace, and sometimes even your identity. But when the empath stops reacting impulsively, manipulative dynamics begin collapsing naturally. The empath no longer argues endlessly, no longer chases explanations, no longer tries to rescue every broken connection. And strangely, this calmness often unsettles people more than confrontation ever did. Why? Because silence removes emotional predictability. People can handle your tears. People can handle your anger. But they struggle deeply with your indifference, especially when they remember how deeply you once cared. This is why some individuals return the moment an empath emotionally disconnects. Not always because they changed, but because they can suddenly feel the loss of access. Human beings often take emotional presence for granted until it disappears completely. And by then, the empath is no longer trying to convince anyone of their worth. They have finally learned something life-changing. The right people do not require endless explanations to treat you with respect. And once that truth settles into the empath's soul, their silence stops feeling empty. It starts feeling sacred. There is a silent grief that comes with becoming emotionally intelligent. A grief nobody prepares empaths for. Because growth does not only reveal who loves you, it reveals who only loved access to you. And that realization can feel devastating. Many empaths spend years believing their patience will eventually heal relationships. They believe if they stay understanding long enough, communicate clearly enough, love deeply enough, people will finally meet them halfway. But emotional intelligence eventually forces them to confront a brutal truth. Some people are attached to your empathy precisely because it allows them to avoid accountability. Your forgiveness became their hiding place. Your explanations became their escape route. Your compassion became the reason unhealthy cycles survived far longer than they should have. This is why the empath's silence feels so powerful once it arrives. For the first time, emotional energy is no longer leaking into people determined to drain it. The empath begins protecting their inner world, instead of offering unlimited access to it. And psychologically, this changes the nervous system in profound ways. The body no longer remains trapped in constant emotional hypervigilance. There is less overthinking, less emotional anticipation, less obsession over how others feel about them. The empath slowly stops monitoring everyone else's emotional state and finally begins listening to their own. That shift feels almost unreal at first, because many empaths were conditioned to believe self-abandonment was kindness. They confused emotional self-sacrifice with love. So when they begin choosing silence over emotional over-explanation, guilt immediately appears. They wonder if they are becoming cold, selfish, detached. But true emotional maturity understands the difference between cruelty and boundaries. Cruel people enjoy hurting others. Healed people simply stop hurting themselves to keep others comfortable. That distinction changes everything. And this is where silent power becomes visible externally. The empath's energy changes. They stop trying to convince people to stay. Stop arguing for basic respect. Stop explaining why their feelings matter. Instead, they observe, quietly, carefully. And for the first time in their lives, they allow people to reveal themselves without interruption. No rescuing, no rationalizing, no emotional chasing. Just awareness. Ironically, this is often when the empath becomes most attractive psychologically. Their calmness creates mystery. Their restraint creates presence. Their emotional discipline commands respect in ways constant emotional availability never could. Because silence carries weight when it comes from someone who once gave endless chances. And the people who underestimated the empath usually realize too late what they lost. Not because the empath became louder, but because they finally became unavailable to emotional chaos. And nothing confuses manipulative people more than an empath who no longer needs to explain their peace. One of the deepest misconceptions about empaths is that they are fragile. In reality, most empaths are emotionally durable beyond comprehension. They have survived emotional environments that would have hardened many people permanently. They have carried grief silently while comforting others. They have absorbed tension, disappointment, betrayal, and emotional confusion while still trying to remain gentle. Their strength was never absent. It was simply hidden beneath compassion. But when an empath finally stops explaining themselves, that hidden strength becomes impossible to ignore. Because silence requires enormous emotional control. It is easy to react instantly, easy to defend yourself, easy to send the paragraph, prove the point, reopen the wound, and desperately seek validation from people committed to misunderstanding you. But restraint? Restraint demands self-awareness. It demands nervous system regulation. It demands the ability to tolerate being seen incorrectly without collapsing into self-betrayal. That is silent power. The power to remain grounded while others project narratives onto you. The power to walk away without announcing it dramatically. The power to stop begging for emotional reciprocity from people incapable of giving it. And perhaps most importantly, the power to protect your inner peace without guilt. This is the stage where the empath's identity begins transforming completely. They stop viewing sensitivity as weakness. They begin recognizing it as heightened awareness, a finely tuned emotional intelligence that allowed them to see truths others ignored. The problem was never their ability to feel deeply. The problem was giving people unlimited access to those depths without requiring emotional responsibility in return. Now the empath becomes selective, not cynical, selective. There is a difference. Cynicism says nobody can be trusted. Wisdom says trust should be earned carefully. And emotionally mature empaths eventually learn that boundaries are not walls built to punish others. They are filters designed to protect peace. They understand that access to their energy is a privilege, not an entitlement. That realization changes the way they move through the world. Conversations become calmer. Reactions become slower. Their presence becomes quieter but far more powerful. Because they no longer seek attention through emotional intensity. They no longer need constant reassurance that they matter. Their validation begins coming from internal alignment instead of external approval. And psychologically, this is where true healing begins. Not when the empath learns how to save everyone else, but when they finally stop abandoning themselves. Because the strongest empath is not the one who endlessly tolerates pain. It is the one who recognizes when love no longer feels safe and has the courage to leave silently, without revenge, without hatred, without needing the final word. Just peace. There comes a stage in the empath's evolution where silence is no longer a strategy. It becomes a language. A language that says, I see everything now, without needing to say a single word. This is the phase where emotional intelligence transforms into emotional mastery. The empath no longer reacts to every disappointment because they finally understand something profound about human behavior. People reveal their character most clearly when you stop managing their perception of you. For years, the empath corrected misunderstandings immediately. They defended their intentions. They softened their boundaries to avoid appearing harsh. They over-explained because they feared losing connection. But now, they allow silence to expose truth naturally. And truth always surfaces eventually. When the empath stops chasing, the one-sided relationships become obvious. When they stop initiating, the emotional imbalance becomes visible. When they stop fixing every conflict, people are forced to confront the consequences of their own behavior for the first time. This is why silence can feel threatening to emotionally manipulative individuals. It removes distraction. It removes emotional noise. And suddenly, accountability stands alone in the room with nowhere to hide. The empath no longer interrupts that process. That restraint creates a kind of psychological gravity around them. Their energy becomes calmer, slower, more intentional. They begin listening more than speaking, observing more than reacting, protecting their peace with the same intensity they once used protecting everyone else's emotions. And this shift changes their entire presence, because true power is rarely loud. People who are internally secure do not feel the need to constantly prove themselves. They do not chase validation aggressively. They do not force understanding from unwilling minds. They recognize that wisdom sometimes means letting people misinterpret you, while you continue protecting your peace privately. That is incredibly difficult for an empath, because empaths naturally crave emotional resolution. They want mutual understanding. They want honesty. But maturity teaches them that closure does not always arrive through conversation. Sometimes closure arrives through acceptance. Acceptance that some people only appreciated your softness when it benefited them. Acceptance that your kindness was mistaken for weakness. Acceptance that not everyone deserves unlimited explanations about your inner world. And strangely, this acceptance does not make the empath bitter. It makes them free. Free from emotional overfunctioning. Free from endless self-defense. Free from carrying relationships entirely alone. For the first time, they realize peace was never found in convincing others to understand them. Peace was found in finally understanding themselves. And once an empath reaches that level of inner clarity, their silence becomes unforgettable. Not because it is cold, but because it is deeply, unmistakably final. The final transformation of an empath is not becoming emotionless. It is becoming emotionally sovereign. A state where their peace no longer depends on external validation, constant reassurance, or the approval of people who never truly saw them clearly. This is the stage where silence stops feeling like loneliness and starts feeling like freedom. And freedom changes an empath completely. They begin realizing how much of their life was spent emotionally performing for survival, smiling through exhaustion, explaining through disrespect, remaining available through mistreatment. They carried relationships long after reciprocity disappeared because they believed endurance was proof of love. But now, they understand something deeper. Real love does not require self-erasure. The empath finally sees that emotional intelligence was never meant to be used against themselves. Their ability to understand others was a gift, but without boundaries, that gift became self-destruction. So they begin redirecting compassion inward for the first time in their lives. And this creates a calmness that feels almost intimidating to people who once underestimated them. Because the empath no longer moves from emotional desperation, they move from discernment. They no longer explain every silence, no longer panic when people pull away, no longer fear being misunderstood by individuals unwilling to understand them honestly in the first place. Instead, they trust observation over words, patterns over promises, energy over performance. And the people around them feel the difference immediately. The empath's presence becomes grounded. Their emotional reactions become intentional instead of automatic. They stop pouring energy into proving their worth because they finally recognize worth is not something other people grant. It is something you stop betraying. This is why the empath who has mastered silence becomes nearly impossible to manipulate emotionally. Guilt loses its power. Gaslighting loses its confusion. Emotional inconsistency loses its hold. The empath sees clearly now, and clarity is difficult to control. But perhaps the most beautiful part of this transformation is what the empath does not become. They do not become cruel. They do not become heartless. They do not lose their sensitivity. They simply stop offering sacred parts of themselves to people committed to mishandling them. That is the true meaning of silent power. Not dominance, not revenge,